March 3rd, 2020. All right, guys. Today I want to talk about lessons learned from the past, how industry has buried those lessons and now they've become lost. And now history repeats itself. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about how we overused pesticides back in the early 1900s, but especially in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s into the early 60s, and how that slowly poisoned, well, in the beginning slowly, and then it rapidly poisoned the populations to where we became susceptible to disease, especially dangerous diseases like polio, which weren't really a big problem until that level of toxicity reached us. So let's look at an article that just came out, and then let's look at the past and see how we're repeating the same problems over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. Did that not work? Let's go here. All right. So this is phys.org. This came out yesterday. Widely used weed killer is harming biodiversity. Duh. I mean, what do we think? One of the world's most widely used glyphosate-based herbicides, Roundup, can trigger loss of biodiversity, making ecosystems more vulnerable to pollution and climate change, say researchers from McGill University. I can't believe that we have to continuously study this. We've known this for decades. The widespread use of Roundup on farms has sparked concerns over potential health and environmental effects globally. Since the 1990s, use of the herbicide boomed as the farming industry adopted Roundup-ready genetically modified crop seeds that are resistant to the herbicide. Farmers spray their corn and soy fields to eliminate weeds and boost production, but this has led to glyphosate leaching into the surrounding environment. In Quebec, for example, traces of glyphosate have been found in Monterrey rivers, says Andrew Gonzalez, a McGill biology professor and Liber Aero chair in conservation biology. To test how freshwater ecosystems respond to environmental contamination by glyphosate, researchers used experimental ponds to expose phytoplankton communities, like algae, to the herbicide. These tiny species at the bottom of the food chain play a very important role in the balance of lakes' ecosystems and are a key source of food for microscopic animals. Our experiments allow us to observe in real time how algae can acquire resistance to glyphosate in freshwater ecosystems, says postdoctoral researcher Vincent Figuieri. Now the ecosystems adapt, but at the cost of biodiversity. And so do we. And this is what I try to emphasize. Our body is an ecosystem, and we can't keep selectively killing bacteria and microbes because that is what makes us up. So keep that in mind as you learn about how ecosystems work. The researchers found that the freshwater ecosystems that experience moderate contamination from the herbicide became more resistant when later exposed to very high levels of it, working as a form of evolutionary vaccination. According to the researchers, the results are consistent with what scientists call evolutionary rescue, which until recently had only been tested in the laboratory. Previous experiments by Gonzalez's group had shown that evolutionary rescue can prevent the extinction of an entire population when exposed to severe environmental contamination by a pesticide, thanks to rapid evolution. However, the researchers note that the resistance to the herbicide came at a cost of plankton diversity, and we see the same in our guts. We observed significant loss of biodiversity in communities contaminated with glyphosate. This could have a profound impact on the proper functioning of ecosystems and lower the chance that they can adapt to new pollutants or stressors This is particularly concerning as many ecosystems are grappling with increasing threat of pollution and climate change. The researchers point out that it is still unclear how rapid evolution contributes to herbicide resistance in these aquatic ecosystems. But scientists already know that some plants have acquired genetic resistance to glyphosate in crop fields that are sprayed heavily with herbicide. Finding out more will require genetic analysis of the currently underway by the team. Okay, bottom line, we spray the crap out of all of our crops. And it's not just corn and soy, it's sugar beets, certain squash, all kinds of crops have been genetically engineered to be pesticide resistant. And now, because of these types of evolutionary defenses, we now have a lot of glyphosate resistant weeds and pesticide resistant bugs. And so what's the solution? Not changing and veering more toward organic farming practices. No, it's use more pesticides and create new genetically modified traits so that we can use more and different pesticides. So now we have glyphosate resistant, glyphosate resistant, 2,4-D resistant, dicamba resistant, and we stack these traits and we continue to use more and more and more and more of these herbicides. We're using more than we've ever used ever in the history of the world. But it's sold to us as we actually use less because of the genetically modified foods, and that's an absolute lie. So organic farm advantages in biodiversity. Basically, and I already highlighted this in a video a few weeks ago, this shows that a large-scale analysis published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences found that organic agriculture sites had 34% more biodiversity. And it goes on to talk about how they're more profitable and they're just better for the environment. But when we're talking about biodiversity and the importance of it to the entire ecosystem, not just of a lake, but the world, it's a big deal. Now, why are we relearning this? Why do we keep coming back and having to recognize the damage that we're doing? What I'm talking about is a story about Rachel Carson and her book called Silent Spring. For any of you that don't know the story, we were heavily using pesticides like Paris green, lead arsenate, but especially DDT back in the early 1900s. And the more and more of this that was entered into our ecosystem and we ingested and inhaled and touched and were exposed to this, well, we humans had the exact same symptoms and consequences as the bugs and the animals that were exposed to this. Paralysis, death. And it was sold to us in the form of polio and that a vaccine saved us. Okay? It was from toxic exposure to these chemicals. I'm just going to read a little bit about Silent Spring so you can understand that we knew the dangers of heavy use of pesticides back in the 1950s and early 60s. And here we are 50 plus years later going through the exact same thing. Lessons learned, lessons buried, lessons lost. History repeats itself. Here we go. 1 second here. All right, I'm back. Okay. Silent Spring took Rachel Carson 4 years to complete. It meticulously described how DDT entered the food chain and accumulated in the fatty tissue of animals, like us, including human beings, and caused cancer and genetic damage. A single application on a crop, she wrote, killed insects for weeks and even months. Not only the targeted insects, but countless more. And remained toxic in the environment even after it was diluted by the rainwater. Carson concluded that DDT and other pesticides had irrevocably harmed animals and had contaminated the world's food supply. The book's most haunting and famous chapter, A Fable for Tomorrow, depicted nameless American town where all life, from fish to birds to apple blossoms to human children, had been silenced by the insidious effects of DDT. First serialized in the New Yorker in June 1962, the book alarmed readers across America and, not surprisingly, brought a howl of indignation from the chemical industry. And this still happens today. If man were to faithfully follow the teachings of Miss Carson, complained an executive at the American Cyanamide Company, we would return to the dark ages, and the insects and disease and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Monsanto published and distributed 5,000 copies of a brochure parodying Silent Spring entitled The Desolate Year, relating the devastation and inconvenience of a world where famine, disease, and insects ran amok because chemical pesticide had been banned. Some of the attacks were more personal, questioning Carson's integrity and even her sanity. That's right. Whoop. You question science, you're labeled as a quack, a loon, an idiot. In fact, they say, oh, she's just a woman that doesn't understand science and all kinds of crap. Wrong. Vindication. Her careful preparation, however, had paid off. Anticipating the reaction of the chemical industry, she had compiled Silent Spring as one would a lawyer's brief, with no fewer than 55 pages of notes and list of experts who had read and approved the manuscript. Many eminent scientists rose to her defense, and when President John F. Kennedy ordered the President's Science Advisory Committee to examine the issue that the book raised, its report thoroughly vindicated Silent Spring and its author. As a result, DDT came under much closer government supervision and was eventually banned. And what happened after that? Polio disappeared. Oh no, but that was because we had a vaccine. Right. The public debate moved quickly from whether pesticides were dangerous to which ones were dangerous, and the burden of proof shifted from the opponents of unrestrained pesticide use to the manufacturers. The most important legacy of Silent Spring, though, was a new public awareness that nature was vulnerable to human intervention. And so are we. We are vulnerable to human intervention in the name of medications and vaccination, and so many other things. Carson had made a radical proposal that at times, technological progress is so fundamentally at odds with natural processes that it must be curtailed. Conservation had never raised much broad public interest, for few people really worried about the disappearance of the wilderness. But the threats that Carson had outlined, the contamination of the food chain, cancer, genetic damage, the deaths of entire species, were too frightening to ignore. And for the first time, the need to regulate industry in order to protect the environment became widely accepted, and environmentalism was born. This was the birth of environmentalism. This is when people really started to see that there are consequences to our actions at an ecological level. Carson was well aware of the larger implications of her work. Appearing on a CBS documentary about Silent Spring shortly before her death from breast cancer in 1964, she remarked, "Man's attitude toward nature is today critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." Okay? Man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. We are challenged as mankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. To prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. So if you don't know the story about Rachel Carson, please do yourself a favor and learn about it. I've got one more article that I really like that was written in Salon years ago, 4 years ago. And Monsanto took the same strategy when they wrote A Desolate Year, making fun of her book, to create propaganda around a world without genetically modified crops. This is hilarious. This is called A Desolate World Without GMO Crops, inside Monsanto's demented spin campaign. So 50 years after Silent Spring hit bookstores, big agriculture is still trying to win the public's heart and minds. In the fall of 1962, a group of chemical companies, including Monsanto, at the time the largest producer of the cancer-causing chemical compound PCB, launched a full-throttle public relations campaign against Silent Spring and its author, biologist Rachel Carson. In Silent Spring, Carson dared to take on the world's biggest chemical companies, explaining that their products were not only harmful to birds and bees, but to humans too. In the wake of its publication, the chemical industry's PR machine kicked into gear. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent attempting to discredit not only the book, but the hysterical woman who wrote it, says Kaulani Lee, the playwright and actor who wrote and performs the definitive play about Carson in A Sense of Wonder. In addition to paying spokespeople to tarnish Carson's reputation, Monsanto also sent a parody to newspapers around the country in The Desolate Year. Monsanto painted a frightening picture of a world without chemicals. It was a bleak place. Genus by genus, species by species, subspecies by innumerable subspecies, the insects emerged, the article warned. Creeping and flying and crawling, they were chewers and piercer suckers and spongers and siphoners and chewer lappers, and all their vast progeny were chewers, rasping, sawing, biting maggots and worms and caterpillars. It goes on like this for 5 pages. As we now know, the diatribe was fear-mongering, not fact-marshalling. Organic and low-chemical farmers across the United States are today proving that you can eliminate or at least greatly reduce toxic chemical use on the farm without having to worry about being overrun by pests, weeds, and diseases. And if you haven't seen Revolution Food, that's a great one. Go watch it. I can't help but notice that in its recent PR missives against anti-GMO activists, Monsanto, which is today the world's largest manufacturer of genetically modified seeds, is using the same fear tactics, only this time it's stirring up fear of a world without biotech crops. Like it would be a new thing. The entire history of the world was without biotech crops until the mid-90s. In a recent debate on NPR, Monsanto's chief technology officer, Robert Fraley, sounded remarkably like The Desolate Year when he says, "What I'd like to do is describe what it would be like to live in a world without GMO crops, because that's a horrible thing," Fraley said in his closing statement. Without GMOs, farmers would need to dramatically increase their use of herbicides and insecticides. The pressure will drain more wetlands, will cut down more forests. We will have to take tractors and run up and down the fields and release more greenhouse gas emissions. Banning GMO crops is equivalent to putting 26 million new cars on the road. I hope for the sake of all people that you vote to support GMO food. What a crock of crap. We're using more herbicides and insecticides than we've ever used in the history of mankind, specifically on GMO crops. And they're only going to get used more because we now have this evolution of herbicide and insecticide resistance. And so we have to stack traits, genetically modified traits, to use more and more and more. So they're full of crap. Despite Fraley's dire warning, feeding the future does not depend on GMOs. In fact, the spread of GMO is actively undermining our ability to feed future generations by locking farmers into dependence on expensive seeds and inputs, by undermining soil health, by reducing biodiversity, and more. Keep in mind that the main GM traits that have been commercialized convey just two qualities, or a combination of them: pest and weed resistance. Industry promises for big nutrition or yield improvements have not borne fruit. It's no better for you at all. In fact, it's not good for you. Studies show that non-GM corn and soybean yields in Europe, for example, are similar to the yields achieved by the GMOs here in the US. What's more, we know that the ecologists who warned that GMOs would spur weed and pest resistance were proven right. As Jonathan Foley, the head of California Academy of Scientists, has said, you can't put out weed-resistant crop and expect the weed to sit still. They'll evolve. They will, and they have. Today, we have Roundup-resistant weeds, some with stalks so thick they can damage farm equipment. And we have Bt-resistant bugs so defiant that they've got corn growers in our Midwest worried. Every ecologist predicted that, Foley says. So as with chemicals, Carson raised the alarm about, when it comes to genetic engineering, the risks are too great. The rewards are too minimal. The alternatives too ample to do anything but to stand up to this latest wave of industry fear mongering. And this never ends. We continue to just repeat the same story year after year over and over again. And if you question this, you're a science denier, you're an idiot, you're not smart. But yeah, actually you are. You're looking at all the data, not just what's pushed in front of you that supports the bottom line and profits of the industry. You're looking at the complete picture. What are the actual risks outside of that benefit? They don't look at risk or harm. They say, this did exactly what we wanted it to do. We wanted to be able to genetically modify the crop to be resistant to our poison. It worked. But what else is happening? Oh, don't look at that. We don't want to look at harm. We just want to look at the benefit. And the same thing happens with vaccines and medication. Don't believe me? Well, if you've been to the doctor with your kids recently and they're getting to the age of 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, you're getting HPV vaccine pushed down your throat. You got to do it. This is going to prevent cervical cancer. You don't do it, your kid's going to die of cervical cancer. Well, that's bullshit for one. And I have a lot of data to back that up. But let's look. This just came out. February 28th, 2020. Okay? Looking at the benefits and harms of the human papillomavirus vaccine. Systematic review of the meta-analysis of trial data from clinical study reports. Objective: to assess the benefits and harms of the HPV vaccines. Data sources is clinical study reports obtained from the European Medicines Agency, GlaxoSmithKline, from 2014 to 2017. Okay, so they looked at all this information. 24 of 50 eligible clinical study reports were obtained with 58,412 pages of 22 trials and 2 follow-up studies, including 95,670 participants. About 80,000 males, 16,000 female, 16,000 male. And they go on and look at what happened 4 years later, right? We've judged all 24 studies to be at high risk of bias. Obviously, always there. Serious harms were incompletely reported for 72% of the participants. Nearly all control participants received active comparators. No clinical study report included complete case report forms. At 4-year follow-up, the HPV vaccine reduced HPV-related carcinoma in situ. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. The HPV vaccines increased serious nervous system disorders. Numbers needed to harm were NNH 1325, P equals 0.040, and general harm. So they're just basically displaying the calculations used, but did not significantly increase fatal harms. So not a lot of death, but a lot of central nervous disorders. So at 4 years follow-up, the HPV vaccine did decrease HPV-related cancer precursors. It doesn't say cancer, just cancer precursors and treatment procedures, but increased serious nervous system disorders, exploratory analysis, and general harms. As the included trials were primarily designed to assess benefits and were not adequately designed to assess harms. The extent to which the HPV vaccine's benefits outweigh their harm is still unclear. Limited access to clinical study reports and trial data with case report forms prevented a thorough assessment. So, do the benefits outweigh the risk? We don't know. We do know it's causing serious nervous system disorders. A lot of girls and boys end up paralyzed after HPV. But we did see a reduction in cancer precursors. Let me tell you something if you guys don't know this. Each and every single day of every single one of our lives, we're all dealing with some form of cancer precursor. We're so inundated with toxic exposures every day, and just about all of us have some form of nutritional deficiency, that there are around 10,000 cancer cells in our body at any given time that our body's working to overcome. And usually we succeed. What we really need to do is just arm our body with what it needs, and that is complete, whole, good nutrition and reducing toxic exposures as much as possible. These vaccines aren't the answer. They're not. Okay. Again, if you want to learn more about HPV, go over to the Fear versus Freedom channel, go to the vaccine playlist, and you'll see a section a little ways down that's all about HPV. And go watch Vaxxed 2. Unreal. But, good news. Information about the non-specific effects of vaccines, the damage, the harm, is getting more and more well known. So this was an interesting study, February 25th of 2020, where they went out to look and see what kind of information is actually out there on the web if somebody's Googling, should I vaccinate my child? Because what they don't want to see is anything that points to harm, even though it's valid data. They only want to see positive information, only. It has to be censored and biased to the good and none of the bad. Interesting. And they try to say, we're trying to look for unbiased content. And in their mind, unbiased meant good, or positive in favor of vaccines is unbiased. Whether to vaccinate or not is currently a hot topic in social discourse. Despite the majority view that childhood vaccination is safe and effective, websites and social media content opposing such vaccination are common. In this study, we searched the internet platforms Google, Facebook, and YouTube for childhood vaccine information. We made every attempt to minimize selection bias generated by the internet algorithms. We compared the displayed stance of vaccine information retrieved. Now, most of the information had a clearly stated stance on vaccines or made some sort of recommendation on whether or not to vaccinate. Despite our careful attempt to search comprehensively and systematically for vaccine information with as little bias as possible, this search yielded a sizable minority of vaccine negative information. So they're telling you right here that the vaccine negative information was actually in the minority, which isn't a surprise with the shadow banning and censorship of the algorithms that exist, but they didn't want to see any. So the fact that some shows up, a sizable minority, is a red flag to them, even though it was all true information. This research shows that negative vaccine information persists and is readily accessible online despite algorithms and policy changes. Despite our efforts to censor and shadow ban, it's still there. It's still there because it's factual information. Despite algorithm and policy changes in recent years, even when searching in the least biased way possible, it is important that vaccine-promoting entities and agencies continue to make every effort to maximize their presence online so that parents searching the internet to answer the question, should I vaccinate my child, continue to receive vaccine-positive information, which means, and pay attention to the fact that not once did they say factual information, whether good or bad. They say, we don't want vaccine negative showing up. We just want vaccine positive showing up. So we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to propaganda and brainwashing the public that vaccines really are safe and effective, even though they're not. Okay, if we're talking about factual truth versus lies instead of negative versus positive, because what's out there is all basically true, both negative and positive. Yeah, vaccines harm. They cause autism. They cause epilepsy, diabetes, eczema, rheumatoid arthritis, paralysis, encephalopathy, encephalitis. It goes on and on. It does do that. It also reduces the incidence rate of infectious diseases. But are we healthier for it? Everything comes in a package. We got rid of all the insects. All the animals started dying. People were getting sick. We got rid of the pesticides. Nature started to do a turnaround. We vaccinate the crap out of everybody. We use antibiotics and antivirals and antimicrobials, and everybody's health is declining. We have chronic illness taking over everything. If we started to reverse that and support the body's healthy bacteria using probiotics and clean nutrition and reducing toxic exposures, we can turn it all around. But science will not allow that to happen. The industry whose goal is to control and manipulate nature are the ones that will always have the money to control the narrative. Okay? They want you to believe that the anti-vaccine or the anti-GMO or naturalists and holistic health and all these things are crazy whack jobs that are only out there for one thing: personal profit gain. Well, let me ask you something. Of all the people that have approached you about vaccine risk, anybody in your life that said, have you really looked at the data? Vaccines harmed my child, and I want you to be aware of the risk. What is their motivation? Is it personal profit gain? Absolutely not. Am I trying to sell you vitamins and nutrients that I'm creating so that I can make money? Nope. I'm not making any money. And in fact, I'm sacrificing my time and effort and resources to do these videos just because I don't want to see people hurt the way my son is hurt every single day, every day. And I want you guys to recognize that nature, and in my perspective, God, has it right. And we don't have to intervene like this. When you guys have time, I'm going to put this link in the description. I want you to go watch this. It's a short little video that this channel put together about pesticides, DDT, Rachel Carson, and her book Silent Spring. It's short, but it'll give you a good perspective of what I was talking about in my past video where I said polio is eradicated thanks to vaccines, which is total BS. And I talk about how DDT and lead arsenate and Paris green and many other pesticides were so heavily used that it destroyed our body. The pesticides itself caused nervous system damage and paralysis that was called polio, but also destroyed the guts of everybody, allowing enterovirus, the polio viruses, there's 3 of them, to exit the intestinal tract and have access to our central nervous system, causing paralysis, multiple ways that these pesticides destroyed our health. And I would say they would actually fumigate lunchrooms, spray parks, crop dust communities. It was in the carpet. It was sprayed in the wallpaper. They said DDT was good for people. It was everywhere, and it destroyed the world. And thanks to this woman and her book, she was able to challenge the narrative and wake people up to the dangers and destruction that was happening. But it's happening again. We have colony collapse of our pollinators. We lose hundreds of species of insects every day. Gone forever. And it's all tied back to the amount of poison we spray in the environment every single day. This book changed the world, and yet we've slowly forgotten that lesson and are right back where we were in 1955. We have so much chronic illness, and it is from being poisoned every single day. And science will say, if you question us, you're crazy. But look, there's books after book after book. Let me go in here. Science for Sale. How to End the Autism Epidemic. Health and Nutrition Secrets that can save your life. Crooked Man-Made Diseases. Explained. Dissolving Illusions. Excitotoxins. These are just a few. Heck, toxicology. We are being poisoned every day. These books are highly referenced. Pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and hundreds of studies that are referenced in these books to prove causation of the poisoning of our people and why we're here today, all in the name of science. So go do your research and figure it out. All right, guys? There's so much to it, but we are in control. We are the next generation of a revolution of change if we only speak up and demand cleanliness and truth. Thanks, guys. Love you.